To begin telling the story of how Florida's queer population grew stronger through the worst of situations, we must begin somewhere you wouldn't expect. Halfway across the world, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Fighting Japan. Let's take a step back. From 1939 to 1945, the world was involved in the deadliest conflict in human history, the Second World War. In Europe, the Allied powers were fighting a vicious battle against fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill once described it as, quote, "a moment when you will have to fight with all the odds against you and a precarious chance of survival." The Allies were desperate, and ever since the German blockade came into effect, America could not aid them. Until Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, the United States was
suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Across America, people signed up in droves to support the war effort, and, due to views during the war, only men were allowed to enlist. This led to women taking a leading role in manufacturing across the country, causing them to become a major sector of the workforce. Meanwhile, in Europe and the Pacific, American men were fighting the Axis powers. Through brutal warfare, men were fighting for their lives, and for each other. From this, bonds formed. Men became friends, friends became companions, and companions became partners. Soldiers entered romantic relationships with fellow soldiers, yet they still had wives, spouses, and partners back in America. And upon returning home, three ideas emerge. 1. Veterans have a desire to distance themselves from their experiences in the war, including their relationships. 2. Veterans have a desire to prove their own faithfulness by expressing their disdain for homosexual Americans. And 3. Males would now have to take their place in American society, all of which increased feelings of American homophobia and misogyny. And, upon returning home, many of these veterans had become of age to vote, 21 years old. Some had even become of age to run for elected office. So, driven by their feelings of homophobia, misogyny, and pro-veteran ideals, the voters became drawn to candidates that reflected their interests. And, supported by their veteran status, post-war ideals, and their demonization of gay voters, these candidates won election bids across the country. Veterans driven by guilt and shame, gay men being demonized across the country, and politicians using both to their advantage. Through one event, a barrier had been created, an uncrossable frontier, guarded by hate and suspicion, all in time for the Cold War. During the Cold War, a fear of supposed communist insiders permeated every aspect of daily life, and soon, the government took an interest in these suspected defectors. Senator Joseph McCarthy became infamous for his claims to know of these communist traitors, stating that he alone held knowledge of communist spies. McCarthy backed his claims by stating that homosexuals could be blackmailed by communists into being outed. This witch hunt for homosexual employees would later become known as the Lavender Scare. Which brings us to the Johns Committee. Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, commonly known as the Johns Committee, was formed in 1965 to combat desegregation. Primarily, the committee targeted the actions of the NAACP, a civil rights organization. It was through this persecution that the committee began to use communism to demonize their enemies, as they sought to draw connections between civil rights organizations and the USSR. Though, to the committee's disdain, their efforts to undermine the NAACP failed, and so, to continue its existence, the Johns Committee needed a new focus, and the Lavender Scare handed one right to them. The committee, despite its namesake, lacked any legislative power to act on their intentions, though, through their sweeping investigative powers, they were able to find their enemy and how to fight them. They became convinced that LGBTQ students and faculty posed a threat to both state and national security, citing their, quote, frequency to be victimized by blackmailers. And it was through this justification that the committee was allowed to persist, and thus begin their witch hunt. At first, they only investigated a select few students. They would have the campus police arrest the individual, then drive the person to either a nearby motel or a campus basement. The investigators would keep the student in the room for several hours, often with no food, water, or legal representation. They would ask intense, rapid-fire questions, trying to wear down the student until they confessed. Then, once they believed they had had enough evidence, the student would be allowed to leave. Soon, they would begin interrogating teachers. The evidence they obtained from these interrogations was used to expel students and fire teachers, all under the pretense of national security. Yet, this wasn't nearly the lengths they were willing to go. Later in the committee's lifespan, they began hiring informants, roommates, friends, romantic partners, anyone they could bribe into exposing suspected homosexuals. Sometimes, they would convince the university to replace one roommate with another, with the replacement being an informant. No one, not friends, not family, not partners, could be trusted, so long as the Johns Committee was being funded. Though fortunately, that was all about to change. In 1964, Florida's citizens were given a bombshell. The pamphlet Homosexuality and Citizenship in Florida, commonly known as the Purple Pamphlet. This booklet was the committee's final attempt to turn the public against the homosexual community. The pamphlet was intended to demonize LGBTQ men, containing crude and explicit content. Citizens across the state called it lewd and disgusting. And yet, on the back of the pamphlet, plain and clear, was the seal of the state of Florida. The people were outraged. Outraged at how their tax dollars were being used. And, revolted by the nature and content of the state-sponsored brochure, lawmakers forbid any further printing of the pamphlet and cut all funding for the committee. On July 1st, 1965, the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee officially disbanded. Later, in a 1972 interview, Charlie John stated that he was proud of his work with the committee. Quote, "I don't get no love out of hurting people, but that situation in Gainesville, my Lord have mercy. I never saw nothing like it in my life. If we saved one boy from being made homosexual, it was justified." Quote. Charlie Johns passed away in 1990 at the age of 84 in Gainesville, Florida, the very same town he worked to terrorize. The Cold War's impacts are far greater and wider than commonly shown. The men on the Johns Committee were elected to their positions, in large part due to their status as veterans. These men have become close with other men during the war, then shunned male affection because of their trauma. They hunted down, terrorized, and persecuted LGBTQ men and women across Florida. Yet despite this, Florida's LGBTQ population flourished in the committee's downfall. A group, having been turned against the very place they call home, appeared stronger and prouder than they were before, shattering expectations and crossing a historical frontier.